Security Council Resolution 1540 is a resolution that was passed by the Security Council in New York in April of 2004, and it was a direct response to the growing threat of non-state actors, terrorists, obtaining nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. It's a resolution that was pushed initially by the Bush administration, as I mentioned, early in 2004, and resulted ultimately in the resolution and a follow-on series of resolutions that re-upped efforts to try to encourage governments around the world to increase efforts to prevent terrorist acquisition of weapons of mass destruction. Okay. Certainly 9/11 raised, I think, the specter of catastrophic nuclear terrorism for certainly the United States government, governments on the Security Council, and indeed governments around the world. And everyone, I think, increasingly in this day and age recognizes that with enhanced technology flows and so forth, the threat of terrorists obtaining a weapon of mass destruction has increased quite dramatically in the course of this century. As a result of the A.Q. Khan affair, in which a Pakistani nuclear scientist was exposed early in 2000, 2001, 2002, of operating a massive nuclear black market network, selling technologies to Libya, to Iran, to North Korea, and elsewhere. And indeed, there was some question as to whether or not he had had some communication with the al-Qaeda network as well. The Bush administration pushed for and obviously succeeded in securing passage of Security Council Resolution 1540. That's a great question. It's an incredibly important tool. Unfortunately, there is some question as to whether or not the resolution has been taken seriously by all countries of the world. Obviously, terrorists in seeking to obtain weapons of mass destruction are looking for the weakest link in the chain and will obtain technologies in areas of the world where controls over those technologies are the most lax. And so therefore it is critical that all governments around the world take this resolution very seriously. And if they don't, then there is clearly a space, an opportunity for terrorists to obtain weapons of mass destruction. And that could have a serious implication, obviously, not only for the United States, but for every country around the world. So therefore, Resolution 1540 gives countries, I think, the opportunity to enhance their own capabilities to prevent proliferation. But if they don't see it in their interests, and if they don't pursue and indeed develop technologies and efforts to ensure that these technologies don't fall into the wrong hands, then 1540's usefulness is quite limited. So 1540 itself does not and was not a tool or designed as a tool essentially to try to bridge the gap. It was essentially a tool, as unfortunately most tools, global tools and indeed tools leveraged by the United States government are, as a means to essentially impress upon all governments around the world the need to increase protections against proliferation. So it, in and of itself, 1540 in and of itself, was not a tool to bridge the security development divide, if you will, to reach out to the global south. What we found, however, as 1540 was implemented beginning in April of 2004, is that most countries of the global south had problems far greater than the threat of weapons of mass destruction. So a small African country that is dealing with malaria, that has an AIDS outbreak, whose educational infrastructures are crumbling, and so on and so forth, who has an infrastructure, transportation infrastructure that's inadequate, who has inadequate border controls to police the flow of small arms across their borders, and so on and so forth. These were the problems that were keeping elected officials in those countries awake at night. And the threat of weapons of mass destruction and the proliferation of these technologies to terrorist entities was so far down in the order that 1540 simply did not rank. And so therefore there was a small group of individuals, perhaps, at their mission in New York that understood what 1540 was. But back in the capitals of these countries, 1540 was less than an afterthought. It just simply didn't make the mark. Therefore, the committee, in conjunction with a number of non-governmental organizations, including the Stanley Foundation, the Stimson Center, levied a new initiative that essentially tried to tie some of the development concerns, and indeed the security concerns, across countries of the global south to implementation of 1540. And so what became evident, particularly, for instance, in the Caribbean region, which is an increasing area of potential trafficking of nuclear materials. It's America's third border, and it's increasingly a global transshipment hub for all manner of goods and indeed potentially dual-use technologies for weapons of mass destruction. It became increasingly evident to these countries that assistance that could be rendered under Security Council Resolution 1540 could be essentially dual use in and of itself, and that efforts or new resources to protect against the transshipment of nuclear materials across their borders would also be useful in preventing the smuggling of drugs across their borders, the smuggling of small arms and light weapons, which were in turn creating downstream and negative implications for their countries through the development of youth gangs and so on and so forth. There were educational implications, new efforts to educate law enforcement, to educate lawyers to prosecute crimes and so on and so forth, were themselves dual use in supporting local infrastructure, educational goals of the countries, as well as implementing 1540. It's a great question. It's a tough question to answer because it's how do you prove a negative? We have not had an incident where, as far as we know, a weapon of mass destruction has fallen into the hands of a terrorist. I think the question, in looking at the preponderance of evidence, would be yes. That we certainly have, at a minimum, we have an increased sense around the world that the proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons to non-state actors is a bad thing, and that governments must be aware of this and should be acting full out to prevent that from occurring. So at a minimum, if we can only assume that that is what has happened, that's not a bad thing. There's a great deal of potential, however, in 1540, and if the requisite political attention is brought to the issue, I think, as well as the necessary sensitivities in recognizing that we cannot and should not, frankly, morally, be pushing small countries in Africa to redirect internal resources from preventing malaria, fighting AIDS, to fighting weapons of mass destruction. If we recognize that and are sensitive to it, and indeed begin to build mechanisms that attempt to really assist these countries in not only meeting what we believe is the greatest national security and international security threat of our time, but frankly is also an issue of critical importance to these countries from a development perspective, then I think that 1540 could be a great tool in our arsenal to prevent weapons of mass destruction proliferation. What I think has happened to some extent in the wake of 9/11 is that the threat of a nuclear-armed terrorist has sort of kind of captured the imagination of Hollywood and of policymakers, and so much, I think, was kind of sold to us as an effort to prevent nuclear terrorism. When in reality, this is not this is not an easy thing to, an easy hurdle to jump. And a nuclear-armed terrorist is as I say, is a high bar. It's not easy to develop a nuclear weapon. It's not easy to develop a biological weapon that is usable in any sort of mass casualty incident. And so in many cases, I think the threat is overblown. But there's a caveat to that. Despite the fact that the threat may be low, the possibility may be low, the consequences of that occurring are so large and so unimaginable for any of us that if we are not going full out to prevent that possibility, then we, I think, are underserving the American people and indeed the international community in not making them safer.
Yeah.